In 2014, arguably one of the most significant podcasts in American history released and changed the face of podcasting forever. What was the show and what was the impact? Let's get into it. Welcome back to another episode of Theory of Why. My name is Rob Johnson. I just wanted to remind you guys this episode is sponsored by our friends over at Key Bank. More on them in a little bit. So let's talk about Serial and why this podcast was so popular and how it changed really how consumers looked at podcasting as a medium art platform, really. In the early 2000s. So Serial, just for some backstory, it's produced by Sarah Koenig and Julie Snyder, and it's under the brand This American Life, which is owned by the New York Times. And what Serial did was it's an audio-only podcast that each season focused on one true crime story. So the first one was released in 2014, and then they had another one in 2015, and then the final season that they've released was in 2018. But really what I want to focus on is that first season, because that's where all of the attention was drawn. Now, what was really fascinating about Serial is as of 2018, the episodes were downloaded over 340 million times. That's almost as much as there are people in the United States. So 340 million downloads over the course of 5 years, that's pretty significant. And what was so fascinating to me about Serial is it did something at the right time, at the right place, and it just captured the attention and interest of so many people because of how it was produced. So let's get into actually what Serial is. So largely Serial it's a podcast series that goes week by week. Each week is a new development in the story. And one of the reasons it was so successful is because of the actual audio engineering and the way that Sarah Koenig told the story. And she's a tremendous storyteller. And it's important when you produce anything, whether it's a podcast or a video or a book, whatever it is, you have to have an engaging storyline. You have to have something that keeps people's attention. And just from the very beginning of the episode, the first episode, you can see how she's building a story. So if you haven't listened to it, highly recommend you put it on your next to listen to list. Again, it is audio only. And you'll see in that first episode what a masterful job she does about discussing memory and how people remember certain events, even events that took place a couple of weeks ago, even things that might just seem so commonsensical. And she does that to illustrate the fact that it's difficult to remember what you did 2 weeks ago, let alone a year ago. And that's important to the case. I think if I were to make a list of the top reasons that Serial was so successful as a podcast, it's largely because there was, again, a very compelling storyline. You had subject matter that was in the center of the culture, and it was kind of the pioneering of the true crime genre. Now, there's true crime podcasts before Serial, don't get me wrong, but Serial popularized the true crime platform because Serial dealt with the case of Adnan Syed. So essentially, just to break down the case in 30 seconds, Serial focused on Adnan Syed. He was imprisoned for killing his girlfriend and his ex-girlfriend in 1999. They were both high school students, both 18 years old. And the prosecution made a case that because his girlfriend broke up with him and moved on to somebody else, he had all of this jealous rage and ended up killing her. And then one of his friends corroborated the story and gave them details on how it happened. Now, what was interesting about this case is there was a lot of unreliable witnesses and a lot of witnesses that had ulterior motives for testifying. And Sarah goes to Adnan's family, goes to the people that were involved with the prosecution, goes to witnesses, and really does an interview. And this gets me to the next point as to why I think Serial was so successful. It's unbiased. Now, that's hard to say in today's culture, that there's things that are unbiased in the media and people that are truly seeking after topics to see what was really right or wrong. But there was such an authenticity with Sarah's delivery with the podcast. You could really see why she cared so much about this case, is because she really wanted to get to the bottom of it. And you could see her wrestling as the episodes went on with, did he do it? Didn't he do it? And you could just see, or listen to rather, in real time, her thoughts on the matter. And what was a really interesting hook of the show too is she'd call Adnan from prison, and she would talk to him and get his perspective on things. And you could tell at times he was being frustrated because he felt like she wasn't on his side. And it was just such a beautifully done show. And I think what a lot of listeners probably didn't like about the show is it didn't end with a grand crescendo that ended with him getting out of prison. You know, at the time of the show's final episode, it was just still in the hands of, you know, the various courts, appeals courts, and then, you know, trying to work their way up to the Supreme Court to figure out what exactly could be done to try and overturn this case due to lack of evidence. And what's interesting now is, as we sit here in 2023, quick spoiler, Adnan did get out of prison, I believe, late last year, due to lack of evidence, and I believe they did a retrial. So he ended up getting out, but he was in prison for over 20 years. But Serial, large part, played a major role in popularizing this case and gaining more attention that helped, I think, ultimately free Adnan. So Serial, again, was just it's this type of podcast that is, I believe, once in a generation. And obviously you have major podcasters out there like Adam Carolla and Joe Rogan and Bill Burr, and NPR has a stable of shows that are extremely successful. And you have these shows that, you know, continue to grow and gain success, but you also have these series and these shows that are one-offs that just change the way culture works. And in my opinion, because Serial was so popular, it launched the podcasting medium into a new stratosphere, just a completely new level of podcasting, because in some ways, I think Serial legitimized the art form of podcasting in terms of media and reporting. And again, that's not to say there wasn't true media or true journalism being done before Serial. There certainly was. But I think Serial did an exceptional job of explaining just exactly how investigative journalism can be done in a way that is attractive and meaningful to listeners, to get people to stay engaged and to get excited about something and become passionate. And prior to this, what you saw was, you know, things like 60 Minutes and 2020 and, you know, the evening news. And that's typically how, you know, these stories were delivered. And this new platform of, you know, Apple and Spotify podcasts and all of these different, you know, genres inside of the podcasting spectrum just weren't being, you know, done. They weren't being done well, in my opinion. So again, we talked about, you know, kind of the compelling nature of the podcast, the subject matter. I think that Sarah's authenticity is tremendous. And all of those things go into the next reason it was successful, is the word of mouth. So again, sometimes you create something at the right time in history, and it meshes with culture. It meshes with where certain trends are. Look at the iPhone when Steve Jobs created it. It was at the right time and the right place in our culture where we needed a device that would level up what we previously saw with Nokia and BlackBerry and all of these other, you know, PDA type messengers or phones. But this came in 2013, really, as social media was starting to take off as well, which caused tremendous word of mouth. It gained tremendous momentum due to, you know, the standard print media as well as social media. So the timing was just impeccable as far as the release. And again, I don't know of a podcast that was as well produced as that up until that time. If you listen to the show, I often tell people, if you want a master class in audio engineering, go and listen to Serial all the way through and listen to all of the elements that they weave into that show, which I think is as responsible as the story for making it successful. I often tell people, if you're trying to get into podcasting and you're trying to start a show, if it's not recorded well, you can have the best message in the world, but if your audio is terrible, then no one's going to want to hear what you have to say because it's going to be a struggle to listen to it. And to me, Serial is one of the easiest listens in terms of audio production because of how well it's done. So if you haven't done so yet and you want to know more about podcasting and the success that you can have with podcasting, or just how it works as a platform altogether, go and listen to Serial, the first season. To me, that's the best. That's where it peaked. I think that first season is phenomenal. And This American Life went on to inspire other shows. Another great show, if you want to listen to a show that's in a similar genre, it's done a similar way. It's called S-Town. I think Brian Reed, I believe, is the gentleman's name, who produced and was the narrator for that show. And S-Town follows basically a journalist from New York, comes to a small town in Alabama and investigates a murder, and then things just keep changing on him as he investigates more and more. So it's a really interesting podcast as well. That's called S-Town. I believe it's 7 episodes. So again, that same type of serial format where it's, one whole case within one season of a podcast, and then it's not revisited again. So that's a really popular platform. So if you're getting into podcasting, you might say, well, what are some takeaways that you have from the success of Serial that you can build into what a successful podcast looks like? So I got some points here that I think might be really helpful for you if you're considering getting into podcasting. And if anything, just take these as valuable lessons. But before I get into the takeaways and the lessons that we can learn from Serial, let's talk about today's sponsor. So if you go ahead and visit key.com/small-business, you'll see a lot of different options for your organization. The first thing I would do, and this is what I did when I started working with KeyBank, is I did the small business check-in. It's a really good way to get a pulse of exactly where you're at with your business and what solutions and opportunities that Key can help you with. KeyBank has been absolutely phenomenal for our business at Wayne Media and Speakeasy, and I could not recommend a better bank. One of the things I really enjoy about KeyBank is they come to me. I don't go to them. So if I need consultation or if I need a strategy session, they're more than happy to come to my office and discuss that. And they're just a very personal, very real, and very authentic. They'll tell you what they can do and they'll tell you what they can't do. And after I started working with Key, I decided to move all of my business over to them, and I haven't looked back. So key.com/small-business. You can find the link in the show notes. Go and do that small business check-in. I promise you, you won't regret it. All right. So now as we get into the kind of the lessons from this, and this is what I really like, because it's always fun to watch something and the success of it, and then to try and reverse engineer that into another show or platform. And, I've certainly tried to do that with all of the shows that I've launched. This is, I believe, the 4th podcast that I have launched. And I've tried to learn something new from each show that I've done. So the first show that I did was probably the most viral show I've done, as every week it was tens of thousands of downloads. Again, it was in that 2014, 2015 timeframe where podcasts weren't being done and marketed, I would say, particularly well. So a well-marketed podcast could gain a market share really quickly, whereas right now the podcast market is saturated and it takes longer to find success. So odds are more people are going to find out about this episode way after it releases than when it does, just because we're at the very beginning of the arc of this show. So as I've done more and more shows, I've just learned more and more elements of it. So the first show I did, it was very guest driven, very topic focused. It was very much on subject matter experts. Second show I did was a solo show. It was all about money and finance, personal wealth. And that was like a 75 episode run. And it was just mainly about walking people through personal finance. The last show I did before this was called Waynecast. It was basically a podcast autobiography about the startup of the company, what was successful and what wasn't. And then with this show, I really wanted to dive into incremental topics and explain how those topics build on one another. And that's why I say incremental, is because every week I want it to be another building block that can help someone with their business. And I thought it would be really neat if we tied that to something historical, just for a record, so we could see the success of those things over time. So when we look here, some lessons that we can learn from Serial. So number one, you need engaging storytelling. So you need to make sure that you have a story that's worth being told. And however you do that, it needs to be in a way that's scalable. And what I mean by that is you need to always make sure that you have enough episode content to complete the mission that you've set forth. And you don't know what that mission is going to be unless you sketch it out. So for this show, my goal number one was to produce 52 shows. And right around episode 40, make an assessment on what I want to do with the quote unquote second season, how I want to change it, what could be better. And even like for the first 10 episodes, I told our creative team, like, let's not even bother with analytics or looking at what's hitting and what's not hitting. Let's get 10 episodes in the bank, and then we'll do a review of just the analytics. So before I even started this show, it was having a idea of what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it. So engaging storytelling, super important. Having a plan, having a mission, what are the goals of the show, also very important. Number three, thorough research. So making sure that if you have a guest, you're doing research on your guest. If it's a topic, you have things written out on the topic. You can go and sit down and do a run and gun in front of the camera. I did that a lot on Wayncast. And the reason why I could do it and the reason why it worked is because that was what I did every day for my job. I went and talked to people, so I gave experiences of things that happened, and it was a lot more natural. But if I'm doing a podcast on like marine biology and I don't know the first thing, like the difference between a fish and a shark, I don't even know if those are the same thing or not. So I need to research that, right? So I have no idea. I'm not a marine biologist. So, but if you're going to do a podcast on that, you ought to know what you're talking about before you get into the middle of it. So that's really important. So the next thing is authenticity and transparency. So people can tell, they have an excellent BS detector. They can tell if you're being legitimate or not. They can tell if you have, if you're just, shooting off the cuff, or if you're talking about something that you don't know about. They have an excellent detector for whether or not you're telling them the truth. That's why the topic that you discuss needs to be authentic. It needs to be something that you actually care about and not just something that seems like a money grab. I can't tell you the number of shows that have called me or podcasts that have wanted to start just because of the money or just because of political topic. It has nothing to do with something they care about. It has 100% to do with the money. And I always say no to those shows because those shows aren't going to be successful in the long run. Lastly, it's you need to leverage community. And over the last 10 years, I've seen some very significant trends and shifts in social media. So 10 years ago, I would say social media was a lot more general. It reached a lot more unknown people, and those unknown people would be willing to engage. Whereas right now, I think social media is on a much smaller scale where it's much more community driven, where you're adding a lot fewer unknown people, but when those people come into your circle, they're a lot more dedicated. And that's why I think we're seeing podcasting spark and take off the way we have over the last 5 years, is because people want that community. They want to be a part of something that's at a much smaller scale. And that's why I think podcasts are having a lot more success than mainstream media, is because people feel more involved with those types of things. So as you're going through and thinking about podcasting for your business or podcasting as a hobby, make sure that you have the storytelling down. Make sure you're being authentic. You have the mission. You have the goals. You know exactly what you're going to talk about. It's well researched. All of that to say, make sure you have a plan when you're getting ready to podcast. So on that, our quote this week comes again from Steve Jobs. I was going through a ton of quotes on podcasting and really just work. Like, what does meaningful work look like? And how does that meaningful work translate over to podcasts? And I gravitated towards this quote for whatever reason. And it says, your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. Now, I think if you're listening to this, we've all had jobs that we haven't necessarily loved, right? They were a means to an end. They were a stepping stone to get to somewhere that was going to be better. But all of those things that you ought to be doing should be a stepping stone, should be a block towards great work that you love doing. And it took me a long time to get to a spot where I was doing great work that I loved doing. And I think I was 28 when when I filed the paperwork for Wayne Media. And it didn't come into fruition until I was 30. And then here we are 3 years after that. So 5 years into the game, and things are stabilizing. Things are better. And I would say that I absolutely love every component of what I do. And I am now falling into that classification of doing great work that I love. And lastly, the proverb for this week comes from Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. It says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Now, I think we hear things sometimes, and I am a big fan of really diving deep into the context of these verses and even quotes. So you might see things on social media, and you might see someone say something like, and this happens a lot on this podcast, actually. So let me use this as an example. Someone will watch a YouTube short, 60 seconds, right? And it's obviously a clip of a 20, 30, 40-minute podcast that I've done on that topic. They'll watch that 60-second clip and they'll be like, wow, I know exactly what he thinks on this topic just from a 40-second clip. And I can tell you this for certain. You can never know exactly what somebody thinks from only 40 seconds of information. So if you're online and you're reading headlines and you're just seeing your friends share things on social media or memes or little infographics, and you read that meme and then you automatically associate that you know everything there is to know about that topic, you're part of the problem. You need to make sure that you have a full understanding and full context of what somebody means when they say something. So for example, on the minimum wage topic, there was comments online that I was for minimum wage and I was against minimum wage. So obviously that 35-second clip is meant to start the conversation, to get people to watch, to get people to learn more. But people are very reactionary. They're very knee-jerk. They don't want to do the research. And social media has made us all quite lazy, I think, in terms of research and digging deeper into topics. And seemingly topics that people care about. Like, you care enough about the topic to comment on it, so why don't you care enough to actually do the research? So when we talk about this particular proverb, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Guard your heart essentially means ensure that you always stay on the path that you ought to be walking on, right? Ensure that you're always doing something out of the necessity of good, which ultimately comes from God, and make sure that everything that you do flows from that singular nucleus, right? So, you've probably heard the phrase, out of the heart, the mouth speaks. And what I think a lot of people will do is they'll get into a particular trapping, whether it's peer pressure or social circles or whatever it is, and they'll start to morph and become something that they really didn't intend to become. And that change happened because of association or because of pressure. And over time, you look back and you're like, wow, I'm not the person that I set out to be. What changed? And it's just like when you gain a bunch of weight or you develop a bad habit. Those things don't happen overnight. They happen gradually over time. So to walk them back and to change it, that doesn't happen overnight either. So if you're in a position where you're like, wow, I'm not really the person that I wanted to be, or my business isn't really where I think it should have been, I went the wrong direction, start walking it back. Start undoing that one piece at a time. And don't get discouraged. I've certainly been in a position where I've looked at my life and I'm like, wow, I'm not where I want to be. I'm in a really bad position. 10 years ago, let's see, well, it was a little longer than that now. So probably, 13 years ago, like, I had no money, was living on a credit card, was cashing out the cash payment from the credit card to pay off the credit card, was in severe student loan debt, and just didn't have any direction in my life on where I wanted to go. And it took, a lot of people in my life to help push me in the right direction. And ultimately I met, the woman who'd become my wife, and she was a tremendous influence on me and had a tremendous impact with who I'd ultimately become, because she saw that there was something redeemable in me and really invested into that. And it really changed the course of my life. But I had to be willing to do it. I had to be willing to take those steps to walk back and say, okay, I've made some mistakes here. Let's change the course and see if we can right the ship. And it's never perfect. It's never going to be perfect. I'm certainly never going to be perfect. No one is. But the whole point, and this is what I tell my kids all the time, is can you do a better job than you did last week? Can you look back last week and say, hey, I've done better in this area. I've improved here. That's progress. And I think that's all we can ask of each other, is that we're constantly trying to take another step forward without taking 2 steps back. So that proverb 4:23, so guard your heart, because everything that you do is going to come out of that nucleus of who you are and what your moral values and duties are as a person. So I hope that helps. I hope you enjoy this. If you don't like the podcasting media platform, I certainly understand. I meet people all the time that are like, I've just never gotten into podcasts. That's okay. There's certainly other media platforms out there that apply to people. It might be short form TV or long form documentaries or whatever that is. But no matter what you want to create, I think those steps that we talked about, the engaging storytelling, thorough research, all of those are, I think, equally applicable to all types of art form and media. So think about that. Take that in. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the show. I appreciate all of you watching each and every week. We'll be back with another show next week. Take care.